Greetings again, everyone. So today I'll be chatting about regional integration in Africa. I want to say that I'm speaking not only as a development economist, but also as a political economist in this context. Okay, so we know that in Africa generally, because we are highly resourced, right? If you think of like diamonds, cocoa, agricultural produce, Africa is literally up there in terms of what we have. But we are importing more than we export. And if you compare us to other continents, such as Europe, as North America, you'll find that for them, most of their exports are intra-regional. So if you look at the case of North America, inter-regional trade accounts for 50% of total exports, right? Same thing in Asia. Whereas in Africa, it's a different story, whereas we're such a big internal market. So a market of about 1.3 billion people, combined GDP of 3.4 trillion USD. We have a growing middle class, and we're consuming, right? So now we have this idea of the AfCFTA, which is Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is proposing that, okay, let's integrate African markets, boost trade, so we actually promote economic growth in Africa. But to be honest, it's more complicated than that, right? And I want to explain this further. Right, so what we see in Africa is that we have the stronger economy. So we have South Africa, Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria to an extent, right? But unfortunately, we still have the smaller players. Most of our countries, some of our countries are landlocked. So what does trade look like in that context, right? Some of our countries are actually vulnerable states where there's both environmental vulnerability, but there's just not enough infrastructure, or poverty and inequality is so high that like trade is just not a priority, to be honest. Let's be real. Then you have your small island developing states where they might not even have developed ports to actually export. So for them, it makes more sense to import than export, even though they might have the resources that are necessary to do that. So in the context of AfCFTA, our economies are not equal. So when we think about negotiating about who trades what, at what rate, what are the tariffs involved, we can't have a conversation of, no, we'll do things the same way. There needs to be a level of understanding what is the kind of development that country A needs, that country B might already be a step ahead on, and what does it look like to trade in a way that is symbiotic, and maybe the country that is more powerful is able to support the country with a commodity and create a symbiosity in that context. So African countries cannot be expected to undertake the same level of trade coordination obligations. So I speak as a political economist that even though most mainstream economists will say, no, this can happen, it's more nuanced than that. So when we talk about this AfCFTA, we need to think about those nuances, particularly now in Namibia, when you think obviously of the context, there's some particular country context issues that need to be kept in mind. Oh, thank you. So I just want to give some quick background on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement for people who might have heard of it but not really, right? So back in 2018, this historic agreement is signed, right? 54 countries signed, and they say they are on board. Only one country out of the 55 EU member states is still to sign at the moment. And then on top of just signing in Kigali in 2018, officially we have about 47 countries that have actually given their formal consent to this treaty to say we are agreeing to be part of the AfCFTA. So 47 out of our 55 agreements, just so you know. Moving on to the next thing. So in terms of the scope of the FTA, it's phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 1 is trade in goods, trade facilitation, dealing with non-tariff barriers, technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary, that's really a big one, like cultural goods. You find that when you're trading, various countries that are receiving those goods are very particular about what are the standards of, say, an orange or an apple. How does it look? How was it grown? What was the cultivar used? So those things actually matter, and vulnerable countries might not be able to meet those standards. So the AfCFTA is trying to address those kind of barriers to promoting trade. Then there's the protocol on trade and services, and also a dispute settlement mechanism, because trade is about negotiation, agreeing how much, to what quality will be traded, but also when that happens, to make sure that countries are actually committing to what they've agreed to import and export. And then phase 2 is more the aspects of investments, intellectual property rights for goods that are being, produced and exported, and then competition policy as well. Because with trade, particularly if you're looking at, you have to consider how does, say, South Africa exporting cars affect the local automotive market in that country. So we need to think about competition policy as well. Okay, so intra-African trade has massive potential, and we all know this, right? And so far, in the context of AfCFTA, 8 countries representing the 5 regions of the continent are actively kind of like now trading. As you can see, it's more of your bigger players, the guys we know, right? Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, Tunisia. What about the rest? What about like your smaller countries? Like, where are they, right? Products here marked at the moment include ceramic tiles, batteries, tea, coffee, processed meat products, cornstarch, sugar, and so on and so forth. But now we see it currently, AfCFTA is starting to focus on key priority areas. So that's tourism, transport, business services, communication services, and so on. And the idea is that with those, they're trying to look at the local economy, see what are the areas to develop the value chain. So what R&D, research and development is needed, what kind of infrastructure is needed in each country, what are the kind of things that will actually make the potential exporters stronger and more competitive to actually be able to produce and export both at quality and the scale that is required for the receiving market. Okay. So I alluded to this earlier, but when we think of regional integration, we really need to think of the principle of Ubuntu. So before trade even happens, right, there are negotiations that happen between countries. So South Africa will maybe sit with Kenya and say, okay, we want this in exchange for this. We want to do this in exchange for this. So there needs to be I don't want to say selflessness, but when power is a big part of the negotiation process. So a lot of it requires actually countries being very conscious of the needs and the vulnerabilities of each country and have a conversation from that stance. So we actually did a simulation 2 weeks ago with a training program I was part of, where we had to pretend to be particular countries and negotiate on various goods. And it was very clear that a country like South Africa, because of the power, was willing to say, no, we will buy from you at this very low rate. We know you're desperate, so you need to take it or leave it. So these are the kind of considerations that you actually need to think about in practice, that like, because we are working with countries that some are landlocked, some are others well resourced, some actually need, assistance with upskilling, or maybe need help with establishing a special economic zone in that country to actually produce better agricultural produce. The stronger countries need to be more conscious about from what stance and what the rules of engagement are when it comes to negotiation. So, I'm an academic, so a lot of what I speak to as well is related to what our trade economists are saying. So, Adejumobi and Kreta propose a development regional approach when it comes to negotiation and cooperation when it comes to looking at trade between African countries. So they say that cooperation among countries in a broader range of areas that just trade and trade facilitation should include investment, research and development, as well as policies aimed at accelerating regional industrial development and regional infrastructure provision, such as the building of better networks of roads and railways. So with the simulation we did 2 weeks, when we finally concluded the negotiation, part of it was saying a country like South Africa that wants to import from a vulnerable country could say, okay, we can import from you guys at this rate. In return, we can provide our expertise or invest in this kind of, say, research and development institution for you guys to actually be better at this good that you're exporting, or develop other economies where there's potential for you at some point to actually start to export. So the rules of engagement need to be more nuanced in the case of African countries trading with each other. Thank you so much. So still on this topic of theme of development regionalism, it can be extended to include cooperation among African countries based on 4 pillars. So the first one, and the first speaker alluded to this, fair trade, building mutually beneficial trade integration, cooperation on transformative industrialization, and I've mentioned this, upgrading industrial development in the specific country, investment in cross-border infrastructure, and you already know in a country like, in a continent like Africa, roads, railway, ports, there's still so much to do. And I won't even go into the fact that our currencies are already different. So even when we talk about value in the rand versus value, in the franc, like it's so different. And these are the things that need to be considered. Political cooperation to build democracy, good governance, peace, and security. And I think this also speaks again to interests. I don't know if Namibia is planning to participate in the upcoming Inter-Africa Trade Forum that's taking place in Cairo, Egypt this November. This is where the cooperation, the conversations start to happen in order to build that rapport, to say we're actually going to work to this in a manner that is peaceful and that is inclusive. Okay, because of time, I'll skip. So I basically kind of like wanted to speak through each pillar. So there's the fair trade pillar, and I think what I want to talk to here is the role of the private sector is really pertinent here. We need like the big corporations to really take part, and I'm hoping that during the panel discussion, we can actually have more engagement about that. Next slide, and then on the topic of cooperation on transformating industrialization, so there's many recommendations by the AfCFTA, right, about global value chains, regional value chains, and I think when I look at a region such as looking at Namibia, you guys are talking about green hydrogen, right? And there's various component parts that are necessary for that. So starting to think about what can we draw from South Africa's resources, from Botswana's resources, to actually develop that and take it from there. So there's also a big concept that, like, even as Namibia, if you're trying to drive this economy, not only think about doing it on your own, but kind of seeing where can you pull from various countries to actually do it faster and quicker and more efficiently and work from there. Pillar 3, cooperation on cross-border infrastructure investment. So there's various initiatives that currently exist. So I've just put this down here. Various corridors and spatial development initiatives that are currently running. I'm hoping that the maybe will just take that to mind and see what's happening, because it's also important to know who's doing what already and where we can add there, as opposed to trying to say, oh, we're going to start from scratch to establish this, instead of actually piggybacking on what is already working and where you can actually gain more economies of scale. Then on the fourth pillar, so this is cooperation and democracy, governance, peace, and security. I've already kind of spoken to this, the importance of networks, the importance of making sure that countries are cooperating to make sure that there are multi-party systems of governance, and making sure that how we drive and facilitate these agreements and the negotiations actually maintain peace and security and democracy across all countries. And then to close off, what I want to say is it's not just about being good at trade, right? It's also being about asking the question, who is benefiting from this trade? And I do want to make an example of the case of South Africa. So our citrus export sector is doing extremely well, and citrus being oranges and Unachi. So how that happened is that farmers, your smallholder farmers, your black farmers, your rural farmers, actually decided to create a coalition to say that we are actually going to work together and bring our harvest together and export. So even by the time they were asking for support from government, they were like, we already have black farmers involved, we already have SMME farmers involved, we need this kind of support. So they even put together, so those farmers who had more like research development done on cultivars started helping to leverage the potential benefits, collaborate, and make sure that this trade development integration is not only progressive but also inclusive. Thank you so much.